All right, so I want to talk about this idea of artificial selection, and I want to talk about this because before we had Darwin and kind of the discovery of like this natural selection and theory of evolution. Humans have been like artificially selecting for certain traits for like I don't even know since like the beginning of civilization, right? Oh, look at this ear of corn that grows really well. We should like replant its seeds. Or oh, look at this dog, this pug here. Oh, it would be really cute to have a dog that's nice and small like that. Or horse breeding and stuff. And so humans will artificially select. So artificial selection, it's man selecting for or humankind selecting for a variety that benefits humanity. Okay, so kind of a simple definition. Within artificial selection, there's selective breeding. So that's where, basically it's controlled breeding. Different traits that we want to have, whether it's a cow that produces a lot of milk, and so we just choose the cows that produce a lot of milk, or the ears of corn that produce the biggest bushel. Is that what we call it? I don't know. Like the juiciest things of corn, we reproduce those plants. We call that selective breeding. So I think the last two units, a lot of this stuff is like it's NBA playoff time. It's make your free throws. Like get the easy points here. So make sure you kind of know these definitions. That way you can get the easy points. And if the questions in the LAC Operon you don't understand those for the AP exam, well all the questions count the same, right? Anyways, moving on to the next slide. So within selective breeding, there's something called hybridization. So that's where you're going to take two dissimilar organisms, so like a horse and a donkey, and you combine them to get their desired traits. So for example, the idea of a mule is, hey, horses, they are big and fast, but the issue is horses are really excitable and they can be hard to train and stuff. Well, you have a donkey. A donkey is small and slow, which is not good, but hey, they're pretty chill, right? So the idea would be, hey, what if we bred a horse and a donkey? Maybe we would get something that's like strong but also calm and has endurance. And we get the mule, which is good for like the Oregon Trail or something. I don't know, like just like traveling long distances and stuff. Now, with hybrids, there can be like difficulties with reproduction. A lot of times, a lot of them can be sterile and they can't have other offspring. But the idea is like hybrids can be stronger and hardier than their parents. And if that's the case, you call it hybrid vigor. If you're like vigor means like you're kind of full of life, anyways. There's also something called inbreeding. So, let's say, you select so here, these are the tallest plants. So we're going to select these plants and we're going to inbreed them with each other. So basically let them reproduce with one another. And then over time, the population of trees will become taller. So similar idea to like selective breeding, but it's like selecting for just like things that are related to one another, as opposed to like two different species. Okay. All right. So moving on from there to origins of life. So best estimate is that Earth is about 4.6 billion years old. If you were to Google it, you probably get slightly different estimates, but Earth is really, really old. As far as like AP exam goes, that they want you to understand, have a general idea of what the Earth's early atmosphere would look like. And specifically focusing on this idea that Earth's early atmosphere was a reducing atmosphere, as opposed to our atmosphere now that is oxidizing. Now, oxidizing, focus on Earth's modern atmosphere, is referring to the presence of oxygen. What I'm getting at is Earth's prebiotic atmosphere didn't have oxygen around. And so it wasn't until you had like the evolution of plants that would then produce that oxygen. And so basically the first like kind of like cells or life forms, they had to be organisms that would be able to survive without oxygen. Now, why that's important is you got to remember cellular respiration, like cellular breathing, using oxygen to get energy. The first life forms would have to have been able to survive in an atmosphere that didn't have oxygen. They'd be able to get energy out of food sources without using oxygen. And then the idea would be volcanoes, like plate tectonics and stuff like that, geosystem type things. volcanoes would start releasing some water vapor into the atmosphere. And then that condensing of water vapor, that would have helped in the formation of some of the oceans. And that's around like 3.9 billion years ago. Not quite as important with like, I think maybe quite AP exam type stuff, but understanding the difference in Earth's early atmosphere versus the modern atmosphere is something I could really see them testing you on. Okay, so when did life begin? Like, what's kind of our best estimate for the first life forms? Well, the first kind of microfossils we have are something around 3.5 billion years ago. So if Earth, began, about 4.6 billion years ago, give it about 1.1 billion years, and you can kind of get the first kind of fossils forming. So, maybe around like 3.8 billion years ago would be maybe around like the first cell. It's kind of difficult to like, you can imagine, like get some of these fossils or analyze some of this stuff, especially like the ages, some of the specimens. Understanding like this kind of time frame, around like 3.5 billion years ago or so. Now, where did these like life is made of organic materials? So when we say organic molecules, that's like made of carbon is kind of the simplest definition of something organic. Carbon's kind of that fundamental building block of life. And so the question is, well, early like kind of Earth, like you didn't really have a whole lot of carbon-based molecules. So where did we get these organic molecules? And the short answer is nobody really knows, but understanding, well, what are some of the different like theories thrown out there? And there's some interesting ones. One is, and there's a lot of different variations of this, but one is that it's like could have been brought like from like extraterrestrial, like from like a comet carrying like I saw something where like they found a comet that like possibly could have held ribose, like the ribose. Why would that be important? A comet holding ribose, like why would I can see like the AP exam perhaps like that. What is important about like the idea of it being ribose? Did it to you? Uh-huh. Say that last part a little louder.
It would have to be artificially produced by
Artificial. If it wasn't on the comet, is what you're saying?
Yeah.
Or, true. I like the idea of energy source, but thinking of like our biomolecules, which structure like of those biomolecules has the ribose sugar? RNA is what I'm trying to get at. Yeah. So thinking of RNA, that's kind of like what would be like, because the idea would be like RNA, and I'm going to show this in a coming slide. RNA would have been the first kind of way for us to like. There's something called RNA, where essentially like RNA came first, then DNA. But we'll get there. But kind of keep that in mind. The idea would be like perhaps you had a comet containing ribose or some other organic molecules. It blasts into Earth, and then something, the first cell kind of forms. Something like that. Now, deep sea vents, this is kind of proposed that perhaps the first cells came from deep sea vents. The idea would be like a lot of the heat from those deep sea vents could like provide that free energy you would need to get those chemical reactions going. But again, you don't really need to know it in much more detail than that. Just kind of be aware of, hey, perhaps that's where some of that stuff could have come from. Now, an important experiment that you want to be aware of and at least kind of be able to vaguely describe is what's called the Urey-Miller experiment. So the idea of this experiment, this is done around, I believe, like the early 60s, 50s or so. Basically, they try to recreate Earth's early atmosphere. So here's what they did. They had this boiling chamber. They had a Bunsen burner where they basically boiled some water, and they got some water vapor that climbs through here. And then this water vapor is going to condense inside here. And they then, they simulated lightning storms. So basically they shocked this water vapor in here with electricity. And the idea would be like within this chamber, there's also some of these gases like methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and then that water vapor simulate. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to simulate early atmosphere. So what I showed you like a few slides ago, like the idea that gases that are around Earth's early atmosphere, they tried the best they can to recreate that, and then essentially it was like, hey, if we like electrocute those gases, like provide a bunch of energy, what might happen? So when they did that, they then begin to get some simple organic molecules forming. So some simple molecules that are carbon-based. Okay, so just kind of understand that experiment, right? Like I don't know if that's going to maybe describe it as much, but maybe in like kind of like a longer short answer or free response or what do I say, multiple choice question, understand like kind of how they could create some very simple organic molecules. Here's another slide that kind of in words shows it. A little bit simpler picture for you. But yeah, simulated Earth's early conditions, provided some electricity, and they were able to form some organic molecules from inorganic molecules. That's something I didn't mention on the last slide. That's an important kind of buzzwordy connection. The idea is they took inorganic molecules, like some of those, like the early gases, and they were able to create some simple organic molecules. Again, we're made of organic molecules, carbon-based molecules. Okay. So, if you're curious what kinds of organic compounds, like there's some basic amino acids and some sugars that they form. Okay. So here's kind of an idea of like, all right, big picture, how could life kind of like slowly begin? Well, the idea would be because Earth's early atmosphere didn't have oxygen, you would need to have an organism that was anaerobic. Now, anaerobic is referring to like using oxygen, and this A in is like essentially saying not. So essentially you need an anaerobic organism, an organism that can survive without oxygen. And so basically you need some sort of organism that can survive without oxygen, and it would feed on some of those organic molecules that that we created theoretically on the slide before. Some of those very basic sugars and stuff. And then the idea would be like, okay, you get this heterotrophic prokaryote, and then you can get the development of more like basically kind of like a present-day archaeobacteria, a more complex prokaryotic cell that would basically be able to feed upon inorganic molecules, things like nitrogen and sulfur, basically kind of getting back to like the deep sea vent stuff. Or like, if you're like down in a deep sea vent, think of what your food source would be. It's like essentially like rocks. Like you're not going to have a bunch of like sugars hanging out down there. You basically need to have an organism that can feed upon inorganic things like nitrogen and sulfur. And there are like archaeobacteria. Remember chaos? Archaeobacteria can live in chaotic environments. There are bacteria that can live in deep sea vents. So the idea would be like those would theoretically be some of the oldest organisms because they can use the energy of like those the deep sea vents down there to get their energy and then kind of reproduce and stuff. And this is a really key connection. Make this next jump here. You then could get the development of photosynthetic prokaryotic cells, so organisms that can do photosynthesis. And why would that be important? Why would that be like a key thing? Like if you have an organism that can do photosynthesis, why is that a really key jump to like really understand? I could really see them asking about. The jump from an organism that feeds upon inorganic things to something that can do photosynthesis. Thinking of like the atmosphere and kind of all the rest of life. What did you? Yes, you can absorb energy, good, but like thinking of the products of photosynthesis. Oxygen, yeah. Bacteria, they're going to release oxygen, and so you then get the production of oxygen. Really make sure you understand that. Okay. I know a lot of this stuff seems kind of complicated and unclear, but this is a really important connection to make. The idea that you get a photosynthetic autotrophic. The autotrophic is just saying like they can make their own energy. Make own energy. And they make their own energy by photosynthesis. Here, chemosynthetic, this is saying that they can make their own energy using like the inorganic molecules like sulfur and stuff. Anyways, if they could then make their oxygen through photosynthesis, that would then add the oxygen to the atmosphere, which then could lead to the production of plants and then eventually animals. So it's a really kind of key development in the history of life. Okay. I want to run through the theory of endosymbiosis again. So technically we've gone over this. It's been a little bit, but the idea would have been we would have had some sort of ancestral prokaryotic cell. So the point here is, how do we get the first eukaryotic cell? That's what we're talking about here. You would have some sort of ancestral prokaryotic cell, kind of like something what I was describing on the last slide. And this ancestral prokaryotic cell, it would have some sort of infolding of the plasma membrane. This would this would lead to the endomembrane system we went over, where you have like your endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus. That would be kind of like the beginnings of the development of that system. And then some sort of event were to happen where you have this prokaryotic cell ingesting other prokaryotic cells. So one of those prokaryotic cells, if it's an aerobic bacteria, this would become the mitochondria. And then there could be another event where you have a bacteria that ingests a prokaryotic cell that can do photosynthesis. So do photosynthesis. And this is what would develop into the chloroplast. So the point is, the idea of the theory of endosymbiosis is that the mitochondria and chloroplast, they were once their own kind of self-surviving prokaryotic cell. Okay. And a key piece of evidence that supports that is the fact that DNA, the chloroplast and mitochondria, have their own circular DNA. That's even an important detail. Circular DNA. Remember, bacteria have circular DNA. Okay. Really make sure you understand this theory. I feel like there's anything they're going to ask you about, like origin of life type stuff. I feel like this is a really kind of classic thing to get at, just because it's a very clear objective. Whereas a lot of if you read like the objectives for the origin of life stuff for AP Bio, it's very vague, a little harder to kind of see what exactly they're asking about. But this is a very clear one. And here's another slide, another diagram kind of describing it. A little more detail for you. But yeah, the basic idea is you start getting the infolding of membranes, of the plasma membrane. That leads to the endomembrane system, so things like the endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus and stuff. And then you get the ingestion of an aerobic bacteria. This would become the mitochondria. And then you get the ingestion of a photosynthetic bacteria. That would then lead to the chloroplast. Okay, so I mentioned with the comet stuff, the idea of ribose and everything, and I mentioned this thing called the RNA world. So there's this classic chicken or the egg kind of argument, and some of you maybe you've heard of this before, but the idea we talked about last unit was DNA has the information to make proteins. But what's the issue with this? That DNA has the information to make protein. Anybody know what this kind of chicken or the egg kind of argument is? Sounds good. To replicate DNA, you need proteins to keep the DNA together, copy it and stuff. But you need the DNA to make the proteins. But you need the proteins to make the, and so you're like, which came first, the chicken or the egg, right? Like, if you need, if you need a chicken to make an egg, but the egg, where did this all begin? How do you get outside of this kind of realm? The idea would be RNA. We know that RNA, we talked about the ribozyme, where RNA can act like a catalyst. We know that RNA can actually replicate itself. So, that really the only way around this problem is that the first kind of source of information storage molecule would have been RNA. And then at some point, RNA would have been replaced by DNA. RNA would be replaced by a DNA world. And why that would happen, why DNA would eventually replace RNA, is because DNA is a more reliable, it's a more stable molecule, first off. It's something that's gonna like reduce copying errors. Like if RNA is copying itself, it's rife with errors. It isn't a very accurate copying system. So the system that we have now with DNA copying itself with all the proteins and stuff, that's a much more efficient and accurate system. So DNA is also more flexible, especially when you get the double helix forming and stuff. So that would be why DNA would have come to replace RNA. But yeah, anyways, the idea would be on early Earth, you would get these short strands of RNA that could then develop. And then the idea would be, okay, thinking of natural selection, the RNA molecules that could like hold more information or replicate themselves better, they're going to be more likely to dominate the population. And so over time, you get more and more complex RNA type molecules that would predominate. Now, I mentioned the copying errors of RNA. Thinking of evolution, and this is a really important thing to understand with evolution, is mutations and variations. Evolution by natural selection relies upon variation. So if RNA is not very accurate in copying itself, it's going to create a lot of mutations, which creates a lot of variation, and that's really what evolution needs to like try to eventually produce more forms of life. So that would kind of be like, in a way, a benefit of RNA in terms of being the first information storage system, is that it isn't very accurate. So that would lead to a lot of different possible combinations of like life that could come from it, would be the idea. Any questions so far? Okay, so that's kind of more of like AP Bio type stuff. Really didn't get into it. Like, the rest of this is kind of a little more lighthearted and kind of reviewing even like 7th grade bio stuff. So, speaking of sex, right? Prokaryotic cells, they reproduce asexually. They're going to make exact copies of one another, like we talked about. Well, talking about sexual reproduction. So, at some point during the history of evolution, the idea of sexual reproduction would have come about. Now, what would be the benefit of sexual reproduction? Why would we want that? Why not just keep doing it asexually? Exactly. Like we talked about, like crossing over during meiosis, you get more genetic variety through sexual reproduction. Crossing over and like a different sperm eating a different egg and stuff, that produces more variation. Okay? So there you go. Fossils, there isn't too much I would imagine. Like I don't see anything on the objective saying you need to understand a lot of the nitty-gritty details of fossils. I just want to like remind you of their existence. It's a preserved remain of an organism. We'll talk a little bit about the fossil record, how it supports evolution a little bit later. You don't need to memorize the fossil record here, but just kind of understand that like the fossil record is going to give us sort of like a snapshot of what life on Earth looked like at that period of time. So using the fossil record, we can infer, get an idea of the structure of organisms. So, hey, what did the dinosaurs kind of look like? Or what types of like common features do you see with organisms that live 300 million years ago, and how might that relate to like the Earth's atmosphere at that time? Like kind of that kind of thing. We can get an idea of what organisms ate, kind of their diet based on the fossil record. Again, the environment, especially like ice cores, can be helpful with that, getting an idea of the environment based on the gases that were trapped in the ice at that time. Now, disadvantage of the fossil record, what can be tough with it is, and this is an important thing to keep key in on, is fossils are hard to make. Fossils, difficult to make. Fossils, difficult make. Meaning that the fossil record is very incomplete. There's a lot of, there can be some gaps in the record where like, maybe we don't have like, oh, what was it like at specifically 382 specifically million years ago? Maybe we don't have an exact fossil at that period of time. So that can be a tough thing with the fossil record, is it isn't quite like as exact and perfect as we might like it to be. Understanding how we date fossils. So there's two ways we date fossils: relative and absolute dating. Relative dating is basically it's just kind of seeing, relative dating is not exact. So not exact. And basically you're looking at, well, what layer of sediment, what layer of the earth do we find the fossil in? So the idea would be, hey, if we found a fossil here, and we want to compare it to a fossil we found here, well, the deeper you go, the older the fossil is. That's a very important yet simple idea to understand. Because like the idea is like each year you're getting slowly more sediment built upon the earth, right? New layers of sediment. So the deeper you go, if you find a fossil deeper, the idea of it would be older. You find a fossil shallower, that fossil would be younger. Okay? So relative dating, you can date things based upon what layer they're found in. Okay? Now, absolute dating, or what we call radioactive dating, also called absolute dating. You know, especially like chem last year, you should have done some like half-life decay calculations. Now, there's nothing in like the AP objectives that say you gotta do like calculations with it, but understand how to read these graphs. That's what I would say. I could imagine them wanting you to do. Understand how to read like a radioactive decay graph. Understand the basic idea of a half-life. So the idea of a half-life is it is the time it takes for half of a radioactive substance to decay. So for example, if we're looking at radioactive carbon-14, so carbon-14, carbon is usually carbon-12, where the 12 is referring to protons plus neutrons. Normally carbon is 6 protons and 6 neutrons, or at least 6 protons and 7 neutrons. Carbon-14 would be 6 protons and 8 neutrons. This is very unstable. So the idea would be when a fossil first forms, the amount of carbon-14 gets locked in. And then over time, because that carbon-14 is unstable, it'll slowly break down and decay into carbon-13 and carbon-12. And so it's essentially like a stopwatch. That's the idea of radioactive dating. Yeah.
What's the reason it's like a half-life and not just
Like the quarter life or something?
yeah.
That's a good. I think it's kind of arbitrary. I think somebody was like, let's make it the half life. But you can make it the quarter life or the 3/4 life or the 3/8 life, I guess. But I don't know. We like halves are good numbers to work with. But yeah, never thought about that. That's a good question. So understanding how to read that. Aditya, you got
I
something?
just had a question.
Yeah.
As it decays, where does the other proton go?
Oh, it's where you get into like the different like emissions, like the positron, gamma, beta, those kind of emissions. Ultimately, where does it go? I don't know, but like it gets emitted as like high energy like radiation and stuff. So. Anyway, so how you would read this is all right. So you had the organism dies and it's here, and then if we look at that fossil and we look at the amount of carbon-14 in there, and we see hey it has half the amount that it should have started with, and we know, this is key, we know that the half-life of carbon is 5,730 years. Every 5,730 years, half of the amount of carbon-14 breaks down into carbon-12 or carbon-13. We could then use that to date something. So if you see, oh, it has half of what it should have had of carbon-14, it must be 5,730 years. Or if you take a fossil and you see it has 1/4 of the amount of carbon-14 that it should have had, then that fossil would be, whatever 5,730 years is times 2. And, using kind of calculus and stuff, you could find out, like, what it would be like at that point, or even just using a very simple, like, kind of radioactive decay formula. But they shouldn't have you use that formula for the AP exam. Okay? Any questions on this? So it should be a basic review of, like, some chem stuff. Okay. Now, I mentioned carbon-14. Carbon-14, notice the half-life of that. That's 5,730 years. We talked about Earth being in the billions of years old. So at some point, all of the carbon-14 essentially decays, and carbon-14 is only going to be reliable within like 100 to like 30,000 years. So like archaeologists use carbon-14 a lot. If you're like dating like old like, parchment or something, or like, things like that, pottery or whatever, that's when carbon-14 is useful. But if you're like, hey, I found this fossil I think is like 1 billion years old, you're going to want to use something like, I don't know, uranium or like potassium argon dating. You're going to want to use something, use a radioactive isotope that has a much longer half-life. So understand that. We want to, things that are older, you want to use isotopes that have a longer half-life. Now, understanding this, like potassium 40, argon 40, What this is saying here is that these come in pairs. So, like, for example, the carbon... I said it wrong. I'm sorry. I said carbon 14 breaks down to carbon 12 or carbon 13. It actually breaks down to nitrogen 14. Not so much important for your purposes, but just to set the record straight. But understand these come in pairs. So this would be the radioactive one. Potassium 40, not stable. Argon 40 is stable. Rubidium 87, not stable. Strontium 87 is stable. Okay. You don't need to memorize the useful ranges. Other than understanding carbon 14 is going to be like used for dating earlier things. These other ones are just for dating later and older things. Okay. And then, all right, so comparing relative dating and absolute dating. The idea would be like if you want to find, like generally when is a fossil going to be dated, that's when relative dating is used. A benefit of relative dating is it's quicker and easier. You can imagine that doing absolute dating requires some like pretty heavy duty equipment, a little more technology, so it's more expensive. But you're going to get a more, right, so difficult lab methods, but it's going to be more exact. Okay, so going over the theory of evolution, the idea would be basic definition of evolution is change over time. So even in marketing, you'll hear like people say like this product has evolved, and they're essentially saying that the product has changed over time. So the idea, if we're applying evolution to biology, is how has life changed over time? And looking at the fossil record, we clearly know life has changed over time, right? Like there are dinosaurs that once lived that no longer live, right? Or like toad species. So life clearly has changed over time. Now, getting into like some like early theories of evolution, there was a guy named Lamarck. So Lamarck's kind of interesting. So he looked at the classic giraffe, and he noticed, hey, how did the giraffe get a long neck? Well, what Lamarck thought was, hey, maybe you had a giraffe, and this giraffe stretched out its neck for like some longer leaves. And then if you were a giraffe that had like, over the course of your lifetime, you're stretching for these longer necks, kind of like somebody lifting weights. Over the course of your life, your neck would get longer. And then you would have a baby who would inherit your longer neck that you got from like stretching that neck. And so then that baby would start off with a slightly longer neck than its parent. And then it would stretch its neck to get leaves, and it would get its neck longer, and then pass on that longer neck, and so on. Kind of the idea of like you lift weights, you get stronger. You have a baby who's stronger. They lift weights, they get even stronger, and so on. What's the issue with that, though? You don't, just because, you like lift a bunch of weights doesn't mean you're going to have like a jacked baby, right? That baby's got to go to the gym by itself. Just because you stretch out your neck for leaves doesn't mean you're going to have a baby with a longer neck. Okay? So that's kind of, that's why this theory is disproved. And early 1800s is when Lamarck was working in, just to kind of give you an idea of the timeline. So then in comes Darwin, and by now you probably learned about like Darwin's voyages and the Beagle and his travels and stuff. I'm going to skip over a lot of that. If you could read your book if you want to get a lot more of the details. AP exam is not going to ask you about so much like where did he stop next on his journey, but understanding what he saw on his journey. What he noticed was when he went to these different destinations, life here was a lot different than life here. Or life on like one specific island was different from the life he noticed on a different specific island. And what he noticed was that life was always adapted to survive on whatever the climate was on that specific environment. So this led him to devise what is called natural selection, which is essentially that organisms that are best suited to the environment, they're more likely to survive and reproduce than organisms that are not better suited to their environment. Okay? So, here's like the different lives he observed, right? So he goes, the Galapagos Islands, that's kind of the famous islands he really did a lot of his observations on. He noticed that life on any one of those islands was slightly different. And key is like it's better suited to that environment specifically on one island versus another island. And the most famous thing that he looked at were the finches. So here's what he noticed. If you looked at the finches on one island, they might have a beak that looked like this. Or maybe like a really big, strong beak. But then if you went to a different island, he would see finches that maybe have a really narrow beak. And what he noticed was that the finches that the finches on the island that had bigger beaks, they tended to be on islands that had seeds, these really big seeds that would need, like if you had a big strong beak, that would actually be more helpful to break those seeds. And the finches on the island that had a longer beak, they tend to have a lot of insects, as their food source, where like having a nice long and narrow beak would be beneficial to like get into like nooks and crannies and get at their food. And so the idea would be that this idea of survival of the fittest, why you would get like this development of like one finch beak versus another, is that if you're on an island where there's only insects and you happen to have a big old fat beak, you're less likely to get as much food as a finch with a nice narrow beak, and so you're less likely to survive and reproduce, and so over time, the finches with the bigger beaks are going to die off. And vice versa if you're a narrow beak finch on an island with big seeds. Okay. Any questions so far? It's kind of a review of stuff you should have learned over time. All right, so then comparing like Darwin to Lamarck. So then, if Lamarck was not right about giraffes stretching their neck to get a longer neck, how did the giraffe get a long neck? Well, what Darwin would say was, hey, variation, just over time, not all organisms have the same length of neck. So if you're a giraffe with a longer neck, you are more likely, you're going to be able to get more food than a giraffe with a shorter neck. So this giraffe's going to be able to get more food, get more mates, have more offspring than a giraffe with a shorter neck who can get less food and survive longer and have fewer offspring. And so, over time, giraffes with a longer neck will, Giraffes with a longer neck will predominate, and over time, the necks will get longer and longer because that is the trait that is more likely to help you survive and reproduce. So here, breaking down natural selection, kind of the four basic kind of tenets, if you will, of it. Variation, number one. If all of life is the same, what is there? There's nothing for evolution to work upon, right? Nobody is better suited to survive than another. So you got to have variation. The key for understanding, well, let me ask you, what are the sources of variation? What will create variation?
Sexual reproduction.
Yeah, reproduction. Good. Sexual reproduction. So that's where you would get like crossing over, random fertilization. So you don't know which sperm's going to fertilize which egg. There's another really key one, arguably probably the biggest, Peter. Mutations. Yeah, really understand that. Mutations, that's a key source of this variation. All right, so when you have that variation, then there's competition, meaning there is limited resources. Like imagine a very simple example. If I said, hey, there's free food in the cafeteria and there's plenty for everyone. No need to worry, plenty of food. You are not motivated to rush to the cafeteria and get the food. But as soon as I say there is free food and gift cards in the cafeteria, limited time, right? Taylor Swift tickets, limited supplies, right? People are going to freak out. There's going to be a competition. Whoever's got the best Wi-Fi signal or the fastest thumbs and perhaps the most money is going to get the Taylor Swift tickets, right? You got to have competition and variation, different Wi-Fi strengths and thumb speeds to get the tickets, right? You got to have competition and then adaptations. Those are the quickest thumbs, or if you have better camouflage. Here we're looking at like butterflies. If you're a butterfly, these darker caterpillars, they blend in more, they camouflage more than ones that stick out more. So they're going to be the ones that survive, and so they're the ones selected for over time. So over time, if you're looking at butterflies, more of the butterflies are going to be this darker color because the darker color helps them blend in on the tree than the brighter colored ones. Okay. And a more like kind of really practical example. This is specifically mentioned in the AP objectives, so make sure you understand this because it's really serious for like our generation. It's antibiotic resistance. So when you go to the pharmacy, they'll tell you when you take this antibiotic, make sure you take all of it. Why would that be so? I don't know if you ever been to the pharmacy. Like the pharmacist is supposed to say, you need to take all of the antibiotic. Don't stop taking it when you feel better. The doctors tell you that, the pharmacist tell you that. Why would they want to emphasize that? feels like a system being put on by the man, but it's actually really important. Yeah.
Just like as you're taking it, the effect that it has on your body is weakened. So you need to.
Oh, that's a good thought. Not so much that. Not so much. Over time, that could maybe happen. Not so much that, Peter.
Bacteria can get a resistance to the antibiotics, so when you stop taking it, it could come back with the resistance.
Yes, essentially, like, you want to take all of the bacteria. Let's say if you take you want to take all of the antibiotic, because if you only take it when you start to feel better, you might feel better, but you haven't killed all the bacteria. So you want to take all of it because you want to kill all of the bacteria. You want to decimate all those bacteria that are making you sick, because if you don't, what you've done is you have selected for the bacteria that maybe had a mutation in its DNA that lets it survive that antibiotic. And so the key is, if you stop taking that antibiotic, you don't take the whole regimen, you might leave. Think of the zombie apocalypse movies, right? This could be the lone survivor, the one that sticks around, and then this one is going to then reproduce, and so over time, we get more and more of these drug-resistant bacteria. So you got to take the entire antibiotic so that you're not so that we kill off all the bacteria. It's watching like a Civil War kind of like a spy movie, and like they're walking around like with a bayonet, like making sure everyone's dead, and it's kind of gross, but it's a similar idea to you taking all the antibiotic. You got to make sure you've killed everybody off. You might think that you killed all the bacteria and you're all good because you feel better, but you got to take the whole regimen, because that will make sure you kill off even the ones that had that slight resistance to the antibiotic. Okay, I know this is going on a long time. I want to talk about peacocks. Another example of natural selection. Peacocks. You ever wonder why peacock males have these bright, elaborate feathers? Well, here's the idea. If you're a female peacock and you're like, because this is actually an important concept. Females, because it takes longer for a female, like the females actually have to carry the newborn to like they're pregnant for a really long time, right? Males can just spread their seed to a bunch of females, and that would be, if you're a male and you're in nature, that is your best reproductive strategy to pass on your DNA to the next generation, is to try and impregnate as many females as you can. It sounds kind of weird as a human saying that, but that really is a strategy you'll see with males in nature. Honestly, if you're a female, you want to be choosy, right? You're going to be pregnant for a long time, so you want to make sure you're choosing the right male that isn't going to that's going to be able to get you your food and take care of you. Okay? So what happens with peacocks is the females are going to want to pick the males that have the brightest and most elaborate feathers, because the idea would be the females are like, hey, if you have these nice bright feathers, you must be really good at getting food or something. I don't know, something like that. And so the males are like, well, what the ladies want is these nice big feathers, so I got to get me some nice big feathers. And so these males then have these elaborate competitions for who can have the most elaborate feathers, and even do the most elaborate dance to impress the females. And I think as humans you kind of get this a little bit. You know what I'm talking about. So, there you go. All right, well, we'll leave it there. We're going on a while. You got enough, or you can do the mastering bio.